Why don't wizards go to space? This is one of the most fascinating and, honestly, kind of embarrassing gaps in the Harry Potter universe. We're talking about the most powerful beings on the fictional planet Earth. People who can teleport across countries, fly through the sky, conjure fire from nothing, and bend the laws of physics like a pretzel. And yet, not a single one of them has ever made it to space. Muggles did it in 1969 with what was essentially a glorified tin can strapped to a rocket. So, why don't wizards go to space? And could they even if they tried? Here's what a lot of people miss when this topic comes up. The wizarding world knows that space is a problem. This isn't some oversight they've just never gotten around to fixing. They're actively studying it. Deep beneath the Ministry of Magic, past the courtrooms and the administrative offices and the bureaucratic nonsense, there exists the Department of Mysteries. This is where the Unspeakables work, and yes, that's their actual title. They're called Unspeakables because they are literally forbidden from discussing what they do, and one of the things they study is space. The Department of Mysteries contains several chambers, each dedicated to one of the fundamental mysteries of existence: love, death, time, thought, and space. These are the things that magic itself struggles with, the things sitting at the very edge of what wizards can understand and control. The space chamber is described as a dark room full of planetary models floating in midair. And here's the wild part. Visitors who enter the room find themselves floating too. The room operates in its own laws of gravity. During the Battle of the Department of Mysteries in June of 1996, members of Dumbledore's army were chased through this very room by Death Eaters. Luna Lovegood later described it, in her characteristically Luna way, as a very odd place, where some of the time we were just floating in the dark. And Ron, still giddy from the aftermath, delivered one of the greatest lines in the series. "Harry, we saw Uranus up close. Get it, Harry? We saw Uranus." Absolute legend. But here's what actually matters. The Ministry considers space to be one of the fundamental limits of magic, right up there with time and death. Think about that for a second. Wizards can brew potions that transform you into another person entirely. They can create objects that are bigger on the inside than the outside. They can literally travel back in time. But space sits in the same category as death itself. That's how serious this limitation is. So let's go through every method of magical transportation and see why none of them work for getting off this rock. Starting with the most obvious one, apparition. This is the wizarding world's version of teleportation. You think about where you want to be, you focus really hard, and pop, you're there. Simple, right? So why not just apparate to the moon? 3 massive problems. The first is distance. Apparition gets exponentially more dangerous the farther you travel. Rowling herself confirmed this. There's a limit to how far you can apparate, and intercontinental apparition is very dangerous. Failed long-distance apparition results in splinching, which is when you leave part of your body behind. Your arm, your leg, half your torso. It's as gruesome as it sounds. Ron Weasley experienced a relatively minor splinching during the trio's escape in Deathly Hallows, and nearly bled out in a tent in the Forest of Dean, and that was from a short-range apparition gone slightly wrong. Now scale that to lunar distances. And here's the kicker. Even Voldemort, the most powerful dark wizard who ever lived, couldn't apparate from the Alps to Malfoy Manor in Wiltshire. That's under 800 miles. The moon is 238,900 miles away. Mars at its closest is about 34 million miles. You'd splint yourself into atoms. Anti-apparition charms can block the ability entirely within a defined area, which tells us that apparition is tightly constrained by magical boundaries, and the vacuum of space would impose its own brutal boundary. The second problem is visualization. Successful apparition requires a clear and precise mental image of your destination. You have to know exactly where you're going, have to be able to picture it in your mind. How do you visualize a specific point in the vacuum of space? There are no landmarks, no reference points, just infinite featureless void in every direction. You can't apparate to a place you've never been, and can't clearly imagine, and space is the ultimate unknown destination. The third problem is what happens the moment you arrive. Even if you somehow overcome the distance and the visualization issues, you'd be materializing directly into a vacuum, temperature swinging from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in sunlight to minus 250 in shadow, and zero pressure to keep your blood from boiling. The instant change in pressure alone would likely kill you before you could cast a single protective spell. Apparition is a non-starter. Okay, so what about broomsticks? Wizards have been flying on broomsticks since around 962 AD. That's over 1,000 years of flight technology. Surely by now they've built something that can reach orbit? Not even close. Broomsticks have a well-documented altitude ceiling, and it's not very high. According to Quidditch Through the Ages broomstick manufacturer Al B. Weeks noted in the 1890s that any broom flew perfectly at low altitudes. But speed consistency tended to falter as they climbed higher. The brooms at Hogwarts would do strange things when flown too high, drifting sideways, vibrating, becoming essentially uncontrollable. There were improvements over the centuries, to be fair. In 1879, Elias Grimstone created the Oakshaft 79, and it was an Oakshaft 79 that Jacunda Skies completed the first transatlantic broomstick crossing in 1935. A genuinely remarkable achievement that's still celebrated in wizarding history. And in 1901, Gladys Boothby developed the Moon Trimmer, which reached greater heights than any previous model. But greater heights than previous models is a far cry from reaching the edge of the atmosphere. We're talking about brooms that struggle at what are probably a few thousand feet, versus the 62-mile altitude where space officially begins. Even the Firebolt, the fastest racing broom ever made capable of going from 0 to 150 miles per hour in 10 seconds, was engineered for Quidditch performance, not stratospheric flight. Its enchantments were designed for speed and maneuverability at low altitudes. No amount of aerodynamic charm works changes the fundamental problem. The atmosphere runs out long before you reach space. And then there are flying carpets, which deserve a mention because they're actually faster and more comfortable than broomsticks for long-distance travel. They were widely used across Asia and in the Middle East for centuries. Britain banned them in 1765 through the Registry of Prescribed Charmable Objects, classifying them as Muggle artifacts. So, the one flying method that might have had the endurance for extended atmospheric travel got legislated out of existence before anyone could test its upper limits. Other countries still use them, and places like the Middle East have carpet racing leagues that rival Quidditch in popularity. But even the fastest flying carpet faces the same ceiling problem as broomsticks. Carpets are enchanted fabric. They channel magic the same way brooms do, and they hit the same atmospheric wall. A Persian flying carpet at 40,000 feet would probably start unraveling, which is a mental image nobody asked for. The altitude problem goes deeper than the vehicle. Magic itself hits a wall somewhere between impressively high and actually space. There's also a deeper issue with broomsticks that most people overlook. According to Rowling, brooms function similarly to wands. They're tools that channel the writer's magic. The most gifted wizards can technically fly without them entirely, which we'll get back to in a moment. But this means a broomstick's capabilities are at least partially tied to the writer's magical ability. And if space is a fundamental limit of magic itself, then no amount of writer talent will push a broomstick past the atmosphere. Which brings us to the most impressive magical achievement in the entire series: unsupported flight. Voldemort invented this. He figured out how to fly completely unaided. Just a human being soaring through the sky on pure magical power. He first publicly demonstrated this during the Battle of Seven Potters in July 1997, and it terrified everyone who witnessed it because it was supposed to be impossible. He taught the ability to Snape and Delphine, Voldemort and Bellatrix's daughter first mentioned in The Cursed Child, which is either canon or fanfiction depending on who you ask at the dinner table. Later demonstrated it too. But even Voldemort's flight had apparent limits. When Snape used it to escape Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall described it as learning a few tricks from him. Powerful and rare, yes, but nobody suggested it could carry you to the stratosphere. We have no idea how long a person could sustain unsupported flight or whether it functions over vast distances. The ability may have even died with Voldemort, since he presumably invented the spell himself. Consider this too. Unsupported flight is implied to be dark magic, so the one advancement that pushed magical flight beyond broomsticks came from the darkest wizard who ever lived. And it still probably couldn't get you out of the atmosphere. And before we move on from flight options, what about thestrals, dragons, hippogriffs? Harry rode thestrals to the Ministry, and they're powerful enough to carry multiple riders. But they're still atmospheric creatures nowhere near the Karaman line. Dragons can cover hundreds of miles in a single flight, but they breathe fire using internal combustion, which requires oxygen. A dragon in space loses its primary weapon and its ability to breathe within seconds. Hippogriffs top out at altitudes where a wizard already needs warming charms. Asking any of them to breach the stratosphere is like asking a horse to swim across the Atlantic. Now, let's talk about the creative solutions, because Harry Potter fans are nothing if not creative. The bubblehead charm is always the first thing people bring up. This charm creates a bubble around your head that supplies a continuous flow of oxygen. Cedric Diggory and Fleur Delacour both used it during the Triwizard Tournament's second task to breathe underwater. So, surely it works in space, right? It would solve the breathing problem, potentially, but breathing is the last of your concerns in space. You'd still need to deal with the vacuum, the radiation, the temperature extremes, and the lack of pressure that would cause your blood to boil. The bubblehead charm gives you oxygen. It doesn't give you a spacesuit. And there's no evidence it would even function in a true vacuum. It was designed for environments where air is absent or contaminated, like underwater. The void of space is a fundamentally different challenge. So, the obvious follow-up question, could wizards build themselves a magical spacesuit by stacking enchantments? Layer a bubblehead charm for oxygen, an impervious charm to repel foreign substances, a shield charm for radiation, and warming charms for the cold. In theory, this sounds almost reasonable. In practice, every single one of these spells has a limited duration. The bubblehead charm lasted roughly an hour during the Triwizard Tournament. Shield charms break under sufficient force. Warming charms need to be recast. A wizard in space would essentially be juggling half a dozen active spells simultaneously while floating in a vacuum with zero margin for error. One lapse in concentration, one spell expiring 3 seconds too early, and that's it. And that's assuming all of these charms function normally in an environment they were designed for exactly none of. Magic in the Harry Potter universe has a strong connection to the Earth itself. Wand cores come from magical creatures. Potion ingredients grow from magical soil. The entire infrastructure of spellwork is rooted literally in terrestrial magic. Rip a wizard away from the planet entirely, and there's a real question about whether their magic would even work at full strength. What about Portkeys? This is actually one of the more interesting fan theories. A Portkey is an enchanted object that transports anyone who touches it to a predetermined destination. So, what if you attached a Portkey to a Muggle space probe? Launched the probe to the moon, waited for it to land, and then activated the Portkey and teleported there instantly. Brilliant, in theory. Except Portkeys still require a destination that someone has set. And they may carry the same distance limitations as Apparition. We simply don't know if Portkey magic works across the vacuum of space. And here's a crucial point. Magic interferes with Muggle technology. According to Hogwarts, a history, electrical objects can't function in environments with too much concentrated magic. A Portkey sitting on a probe might fry every system on the spacecraft before it ever reached the moon. You'd crash it before the plan even got started. The Flu Network is another suggestion fans have genuinely put forward. You use Flu powder, step into a fireplace, and travel through a network of connected fireplaces. The problem here is so obvious it's almost funny. There are no fireplaces in space, and even if you got one up there somehow, fire requires an atmosphere with oxygen to sustain combustion. Fire requires oxygen to burn. Space has none. The Flu network dies before it starts. Extension charms and vanishing cabinets are more creative. You could theoretically create a magically expanded living space inside a small capsule and pair vanishing cabinets to build a portal between Earth and whatever vessel you've launched into orbit. But you'd still need to get the cabinet into space in the first place, which brings you right back to square one. And speaking of getting things into space, the Ford Anglia approach. Arthur Weasley enchanted a Muggle car to fly, turn invisible, and carry an entire family plus luggage. So, what if someone enchanted an actual Muggle spacecraft? Slap an undetectable extension charm on the interior and protective enchantments to the hull and launch it using Muggle propulsion. Since the rockets don't need magic to work, the hybrid approach sounds clever until you remember the technology-magic incompatibility problem. And at a much larger scale than a Portkey on a probe. A modern spacecraft relies on thousands of electronic systems running simultaneously. Navigation computers, life support monitors, communication arrays, thruster controls. Arthur's flying car worked because a 1959 Ford Anglia is basically a metal box with an engine. A Saturn V rocket is a computer that happens to be strapped to fuel. Flooding that with enough magic to protect a human crew would almost certainly fry every circuit on board before it cleared the launch tower. And even Arthur's enchanted car eventually went feral in the Forbidden Forest, developing a mind of its own. Imagine a rogue spacecraft with opinions. Fantastic movie, terrible space program. But the transportation problems only explain half of this. There's a second barrier here, and it's purely cultural. Start with what pushed Muggles toward the stars in the first place. When you can teleport, fly, and conjure virtually anything you need, why spend decades developing the technology to survive in an environment that's actively trying to kill you? Space travel was born because Muggles had no shortcut. They couldn't teleport or conjure what they needed out of thin air. So they had to invent their way forward, and that desperation became ambition. Wizards never had that pressure. And there's a less flattering dimension to this too. The wizarding world carries a deep-seated, normalized prejudice against Muggles and their achievements. Even Arthur Weasley, the most Muggle-friendly wizard we meet in the entire series, approaches Muggle technology with the same condescending fascination you'd show a child's drawing. Ingenious, really. How many ways Muggles have found of getting along without magic? The implicit message is always the same. They need these things because they can't do what we do. And here's where it gets genuinely ironic. Hogwarts has an entire astronomy tower. Every single student at the school is required to take astronomy classes, charting star movements and studying planetary alignments at midnight through telescopes. Wizards know what's up there. They've been mapping the cosmos for centuries. They named their children after stars and constellations: Sirius, Bellatrix, Regulus, Draco, Scorpius. The Black family tree reads like a star chart. Space is woven into wizarding culture at a fundamental level, from the ceiling of the Great Hall, which mirrors the night sky in real time, to the centaurs in the Forbidden Forest who read the future in movements of Mars and Jupiter. Wizards are obsessed with space. They just refuse to visit. It's the equivalent of spending your whole life studying the ocean from the beach and never once getting your feet wet. The cultural arrogance means that even when a Muggle approach would genuinely be superior to the magical option, most wizards wouldn't consider it. The idea of studying rocketry, of learning from Muggle aerospace engineering, of combining magical protection with Muggle propulsion. It would be seen as beneath them. You can almost hear Lucius Malfoy sneering at the suggestion. There's also a political barrier that gets overlooked entirely. The International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, established in 1689, requires wizards to remain hidden from Muggle society. A wizard launching into space would be visible, extremely visible. Muggle space agencies track every object in orbit down to pieces of debris the size of a tennis ball. NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, they would all notice a person floating around up there without a spacecraft. The Obliviator squads would have a collective nervous breakdown trying to memory charm every astronomer, satellite operator, and amateur stargazer who spotted a wizard doing laps around the International Space Station. The secrecy logistics alone make the whole project a bureaucratic nightmare. And if there's one thing the Ministry of Magic excels at, it's killing ambitious projects with paperwork. And that's the part that stings. Muggles looked up at the moon and said, "We're going there." And then they did it. With math, with physics, with sheer stubborn non-magical determination. They strapped themselves to controlled explosions and hurled themselves into the void because they wanted to know what was out there. Wizards looked up at the same moon and went back to their Quidditch matches. Luna Lovegood blew up the model of Pluto during the Battle of Department of Mysteries using a reductor curse to block a Death Eater. A year later, in the real Muggle world, Pluto was demoted from planet status entirely. The Wizards destroyed Pluto in fiction before the Muggles destroyed it in classification. That might be the closest the wizarding world ever came to making an impact on the cosmos. The Department of Mysteries is still studying space. The Unspeakables are still researching, still trying to understand why this particular mystery resists magical solutions. Maybe someday they'll crack it. Maybe some future wizard will combine the Bubblehead charm with extension charms and protective enchantments and supported flight and sheer magical willpower, and actually touch the stars. But don't count on it, because the honest answer has been hiding in plain sight this whole time. Wizards don't go to space because they don't want to. Rowling addressed this directly at one point. When magic already lets you summon anything with a word and send messages by owl, fire, or Patronus, the internet simply can't compete. The same reasoning covers rockets. The real barrier is that the wizarding world has built itself a comfortable little bubble, pun absolutely intended, and sees no reason to leave it. Magic can do extraordinary things. It can defy gravity, bend time, make the impossible routine, and the miraculous mundane. But it can't make someone want to leave the couch. Muggles went to space because they had to find a way. Wizards never went because they never believed they needed to. And in that gap, and that space between ability and ambition, lies one of the most quietly profound statements in the entire Harry Potter series. Sometimes having everything makes you reach for nothing. But space isn't the only thing they've been ignoring. Why are there no wizard scientists in Harry Potter? That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Click now before the Ministry classifies curiosity as a Muggle artifact.